So I want to see what questions you have, what things you're concerned about, and then I have a few things that I'd like to run through. Guys, we might need to get some chairs from next door. I'm going to go to Mr. Ramponi's room and grab a couple chairs if you need one. All right, so as I mentioned, I want to get some of your questions out of the way and see what things that you have concerns about. The other day I did field a question about South Asia, so I do want to talk a little bit about that. So non-South Asian questions. That was your question, I believe, the other day at the review.
Is anything with the Huns important?
Yeah, the destruction of Buddhism.
Okay.
The question was, is there anything important that relates to the Huns? The Huns were a nomadic group that conquered a number of different states in and around 300-400 AD. They affected the Roman Empire, they affected China, and I think what I would probably want to know about the Huns is that when they came into India, they found Buddhism already kind of in a state of disrepair, in a state of decline, and I think that they kind of finished that job off. So that might be something, if you talk about the spread of Buddhism, if you mention things along those lines, that that might factor in, if you mention it in that respect. So. Other questions? Holy cow! We have 20 people sign up. We're going to end up with a lot more.
Hello, boys.
If you need a chair, you can grab them in Mr. Ramponi's room.
I was a maybe.
Do not sit near the robot. I have that there for filming in case anybody wasn't able to join us. So grab a chair from 1336. Other questions? Things you're concerned about? Yeah.
Like the order of the Chinese dynasties.
You just have to memorize that. I've repeated it like 15, 18 times. I can do it in my sleep. I can actually go forwards and backwards. You're just going to have to commit to doing it. I can't memorize that for you. But I have put on the module page, there's a timeline section. And I've showed you this a number of times. I've mentioned the song that's on here, but there's an East Asian timeline right here that you can click on. If you click on the white link, it'll take you there. This is just, I don't like to tell you to memorize things. This is just one of those things. I don't know that there's really any way around doing that. So you don't need to know them for the sake of order. You know, it's not like they're going to have a question on there. Which of the dynasties would come next in this order? That actually used to be the type of question. They don't ask that anymore. But what you have to be able to do is to kind of put it into the context of the times. So you have to be able to associate the Ming and the King with European interaction. You have to be able to associate the song with destruction under the Mongols. You have to be able to associate the Zhou with the Warring States period and Confucianism. You have to know those types of things. So I think knowing the order is kind of important, because if you're kind of sitting there and you're thinking, oh my gosh, which group was the Mongols? And you can kind of walk it back and think, okay, well, the King was the last, the Ming was before that, the Yuan, the Mongols were before that. The group that was before that then was the Song. Okay? So if you have that order, that's why that's important, so that you can connect it to other things. Okay, because one of the first things that I was going to talk about today is that taking something specific, I want you to get out of the habit of like memorizing something for the sake of memorization. You don't have to do that. Okay, you don't have to, like there are websites, and I'm going to share a couple with you today that have like key dates, and there's one that has like 10 pages of dates. No, you don't need that. Okay, you don't need to memorize dates and things like that. But what you do need to be able to do is to kind of take something and to be able to kind of put it into a context. For example, if you have, the Tang Dynasty right here, what's happening around the Tang? Okay, so what's happening in Southwest Asia, and you have the rise of Islam. What's happening in Europe, okay, and you have the beginning of the Middle Ages. Okay, what's happening in North America, the Maya. And sometimes you're going to see that there's a lot of connections and things, and sometimes you're not. Okay, you're going to have to grab a chair from Mr. Ramponi's room. So, it's important to have chronology for that reason. We talk a lot about context, and that's what context is. Okay, it doesn't matter if you can name the specific year that something happened. That's not really relevant information. I mean, it's trivial. But what you want to be able to do is to put that information in context, to realize that the Tang, are within that range of years, and then subsequently, what's happening around it, so that you can connect it to other things. Because what they do is they'll ask you a question that's related to a broad time frame. And that broad time frame, if they ask you about political practices between 600 and 800, then you can talk about that, and you can relate it to the civil service bureaucracy. Okay, see, that's why those things are important. And I'm going to try to drive that point home today with an activity that we're going to do in a few minutes. But the dynasty thing, you just kind of have to memorize it, and you have to know what goes, where. I've gone through it many times. It's on here. I think you just have to sit down and say, I'm going to spend 40 minutes. I'm just going to read it 3 times. I don't really know how else to do it. This is the thing that people get the most freaked out about. And again, I would encourage you not to think, okay, I have to know exact dates and ranges. No, if you know Song Mongols, if you know Tang civil service bureaucracy, if you know Han Silk Road, Han Buddhism, those things are really more important than the dates. And if you can connect it to what's kind of happening around it, I think that would be what is probably most important. So, other questions that you might have that have been lingering? Yeah.
What are like the main things that are usually on like the APE test? Like what things do we like have to not still know but not focus on a lot and study?
Well, and I think this is one of the challenges in studying. I think a lot of times we think, okay, I already can name the Chinese dynasties in order, but I'm just going to keep studying that. Why do that? I mean, if you already know it today, you're probably not going to forget it. It at some point has been converted to your long-term memory, so there's really no reason to continue to do that. If you feel really comfortable with the Columbian Exchange, and you can talk about the cultural outcomes and the social outcomes and the biological outcomes, then don't focus on it anymore. There's no reason to spend any additional time on it if you already know that. Okay, if you feel comfortable with the Silk Roads, and you know what a caravanserai is, and you know what an emporia is, and you know that what religions spread along it, then don't focus on it anymore. Then stop. Turn your attention to things that you aren't as comfortable with. If you feel really good about the 20th century and fascism and nationalism and things along that, fine, good. Then find something else that you're not comfortable with. Okay, I mean, if you play an instrument and you can play the song on the piano over and over again, stop playing it, play something else. You're not going to like completely forget it. Okay, so you kind of need to isolate those things. I think the biggest things, the 5 biggest things that they ask about, one is cross-cultural interaction. And that's the Silk Roads, that's the Columbian Exchange. I think that they ask about that constantly. I think number 2 is the Columbian Exchange. That is just always on there. It's just, you just never really get away from that. I think imperialism is always on there. I think that they ask questions about that frequently. When I look through all these old tests, that's one that jumps out. I think Confucianism is a very frequent part of the test. As far as concepts, that's probably the single biggest concept that you'll find. And they ask a lot about labor systems. And you might be like, dude, I have no idea what a labor system is. What are you talking about? A labor system is slavery is a labor system. The manner in which people are organized around work. That is always on there. They always ask about it with the transatlantic slave trade. So I think that's really a key thing. I think as far as regions, the one that is on there the most is probably East Asia. South Asia would probably be second. Europe is very seldom on there unless it involves an interaction with someone else. So if you're like, oh, I gotta study the Renaissance, I really got to, you know what? That's going to be on the European test. That's not really going to be on this test. They make it a goal to not have Europe be a standalone, isolated component of the test. That's really something that they focus on. Okay. So kind of think about what you need to know, what you should know, and isolate, American and French revolutions. I think it could be used as a comparison to Haiti, but I don't think it's going to be an enormous focus. So that's probably not something I would spend my time on. The foundations period, and this is a trick that everyone should know, the foundations time period, that earliest time period, 8,000, 10,000 BC through 600 BC, it's interesting to us. Egypt, Rome, Greece, those types of, or not even before that, Mesopotamia, those types of things are interesting to us. They're not going to ask you to write about it. The first source stimulus question is always going to be from the foundations period, and that might be it. There might be 2. But they're not going to have you write one of the essays about it. It's not going to be a DBQ, because by percentage, the percentage of the test that they assign to that period is smaller than the writing section. Okay? So it's really not possible to see it from the foundations. Now, the classical age, Greece, Rome, Han China, that could be asked about. But Egypt, Mesopotamia, Indus Valley, very unlikely. I will tell you that I'd be shocked if the first source stimulus is not either on the agricultural revolution or Mesopotamia. And beyond that, you probably won't see it again. I can't remember the last time Egypt was on the test. And why do they do that? They do that because you like it. You're interested in it. They're not going to ask you about it because you're interested in it.
Are they changing the time period that you're teaching next year?
They are, yeah. And the next year is 1200 to the present.
So there isn't going to be a foundations period?
No.
You're not going to have that
So
growth.
nice.
You're not going to have that growth.
I find it unimaginable that I'm supposed to teach this course without teaching world religions, Islam. I wish you could have written the letter I wrote the college board when they asked for my feedback.
You should put that
That looks like ponies and cotton candy compared to what I wrote. It was scathing.
You should put it on campus.
It was too long.
Give us a little snippet.
Yeah.
This is an absolute outrage, is how I began the letter. I just jumped right in. I don't waste a
What
lot
were
of
your 3
time.
buckets?
Oh, I didn't have 3. I probably had 33. The amount of stuff left off, the amount that I viewed the test becoming now Eurocentric, because if you look at it after 1200, all of the standalone successes that a lot of these places had is kind of now cast aside, because they originally wanted 1450, which that's telling you Columbus. But amidst the outrage, maybe they read my letter and said, okay, we better bump it back to the Mongols at least. But amidst all of that outrage, if you started at 1450, everything is now connected to Europe. So you don't see the standalone Islam. You don't see the standalone African states. You don't see the Tang. You don't see all of these parts of the world that achieved remarkable things in doing it that way. I think the decision is short-sighted, ludicrous, and asinine, and that's what I told him in the letter. In a much long, it was probably 10 or 12 pages, and it was in the comment box, and I think it was 7,300 words, something like that. And I didn't curse, but I came close. So, anyway. Other questions before I move to South Asia? Yeah.
On this big idea question,
Yeah.
there was just one that, can you cite 2 forms of animal domestication in world history and discuss how those change the dynamics of food production? Like, I mean horses, but like...
Well, if you remember when we talked about guns, germs, and steel, we talked about the major 5, cows, pigs, sheep, horse, so on and so forth, and how that led to disease, how that made work easier, so on and so forth. I think that's one. But one that often gets mentioned in the form of writing is the introduction of the camel to Africa in 300. The camel changed the dynamic of African history, because now all of a sudden you're able to move across the Sahara and connect regions that had otherwise not been connected. So I think that's probably the second one that I was thinking of, because human beings have not domesticated a major animal since 1500 BC, so that's really in reference to the Neolithic Revolution, but then the introduction of a previously domesticated animal to a non-indigenous area. Africa, and the camel is a good example. I think horses to the Columbian Exchange was a good example, because again, everything that was done there was done on foot. I mean, the Aztec had foot-bound merchants called Pochteca that simply traveled around on foot. Obviously, when you introduce a horse to that concept, it's going to totally change the dynamic. So that's where I was going with that. No? All right, on the front table, South Asia. I'm just going to talk about that. So South Asia is kind of one of those things that people are always like, what am I supposed to know about South Asia? Indian history is not something that people are usually terribly comfortable with. So here's a little presentation, and I didn't put this on Canvas, but I can do that later. I understand why people get worked up about China and India. I get it. You feel like you have this long list of things that you have to memorize. You feel like you have this series of names that you're not completely comfortable with, and so on and so forth. So I get it. And in the case of India, what do you need to know? I think you need to understand the geography of it, and that this has a remarkable landscape, and because of that landscape, because it has everything in it, because India is quite isolated unless you go through the Himalayas or you arrive on the coast, that India's story is a geographic story. A story of its rivers is geographic. Its invaders always have had a very significant impact upon India, whether it's Islam or the British. So I think geography is something that I would want to be familiar with when it comes to India. I think geography is always important. Geography tells you a lot about how a place develops. Okay, it's usually reasonably simple in that respect. The blending of ideas is a really important one in the 20th century. That blending is British culture and Indian culture combining to kind of form this synthesis that has allowed India to become a democracy that's been very successful. I think that's a really important phenomenon. When Islam enters India, all the way back in the 8th century, Islam is a really important footprint in India. And it's not just the Taj Mahal, it's not just buildings. Islam in India have always coexisted quite well, at least until the 20th century, until the British got involved. So that's an important thing. Migrations. One of those things that you just need to memorize is the Indo-European migrations. We've talked about that a few times, but starting around 3000 BC, a group of migrants from the Black Sea area left that area, and they spread out all over the world, bringing with them a common language. That Indo-European migration, it's not on there. I would not expect to see it on a source stimulus, but I could definitely see using it in a question in which they asked you to write about a pattern of migration in world history. Migration is a really important concept in world history. And I think and I don't want to have this be a huge political dialogue, but you have to realize that the people that write this test, this is just a side note on not dealing with India per se, but the people that write this test are like you. They're normal people, and they're exposed to newspapers, and they read Twitter, and they watch news networks and things like that. And they know that when you look at the world today, and it's not just here, but migration is a significant issue today. Okay, I don't think I need to speak about why that is, but so they're going to try to connect things that are happening today to the exam that they're writing. I do this. I would do this if I was writing that test. I told the AP Gov kids yesterday, I said, I would be so shocked, and you may not know a lot about this, but I would be beyond stunned if Brexit wasn't on the test in some capacity. Britain is one of our countries. Britain is trying to leave the European Union. They've been trying for 2 years, and it's basically kind of eroding British democracy, the attempts to do it. Okay, it's in the news every single day. It's driving Britons crazy, to be honest with you. That's going to be on the test. I mean, I would just be stunned if it isn't. The test is written usually a year in advance. So last year's test was written in 2018 for both the AP World and the AP Comparative. So Brexit is going to be on there in some capacity. You're going to be able to incorporate it in your writing. And I think migration at some level is going to be important. There have been a lot of points in world history in which there have been migratory patterns. Europeans to the Americas after the Columbian Exchange. Europeans not going to Africa during the colonial period, but Europeans settling in India. Those are migratory patterns. Okay, and I think that the test is not a current events test, but these are people just like you and I, and they sit down at a computer and like, what am I going to write about? Oh, what's going on in the news? Oh, well, there's issues today in world history about migration. Let me write a question that connects that. Okay, so kind of realize that this test isn't like generated by some cyborg. It's written by a group of people, and those people are just like you, that they have things that they're exposed to. So kind of keep that in mind. So I think migrations. I think the fact that we have examples of Mesopotamian stones. Seal stones in India is powerful. I think the fact that we have such a profound Greek influence after Alexander is important about India. The Mughals, the Mongols that entered into India in the 12th century. So there's all sorts of things that I think affect India from the outside. Indian history itself is very interesting, but the outside really adds to it. Okay. Unity has been very difficult in India because of its geography. So who are the people that came the closest to bringing that unity? Ashoka. Ashoka's always on a test. If there's 5 tests and he's not on 3 of them, I'd be shocked. He is a frequent participant on the AP test, either in a written way in which you can incorporate him as evidence, or in which they would have rock and pillar edicts. I think they've done the rock and pillar edicts or stimulus 2 of the last 3 years. So if the name Ashoka doesn't ring a bell to you, now would be a good time to ask who that is. But yeah, very, very important. Cultural traditions. Yeah.
Well, I know who Ashoka is, but like, can you explain more of like, well, I don't know if you have time for this, but like.
I got all the time in the world.
Like he was like, he was like an emperor, like ruler, right?
Ashoka was the first indigenous Indian leader after the invasion of Alexander the Great to bring some unity to the Indian world. He unified about 90% of India under his leadership, which initially was done via conquest, but after some severe conquests and battles that resulted in enormous death tolls, Ashoka forsaked that type of conquest and instead vowed to conquer only by conduct and persuasion. So he posted those rock and pillars all throughout India that had messages about kindness and empathy and compassion.
Is it like Confucian?
No. It's not. Confucianism is a social philosophy, and it outlines the importance of orderly relationships within society, and that will create kind of order. Ashoka's was more of a religious statement of how Buddhism should be used in the treatment of one another. That people need to be treated ethically and morally, and that you should be kinder to the person next to you than they are to you, and these types of religious statements. Confucianism really isn't like that. Confucianism is about proper. You're going to have to grab a chair from across the hall. Things being properly across the hall, properly the other way, properly in order, so on and so forth. That's really what Confucianism is about. Ashoka is more about empathy, compassion, kindness, so on and so forth.
Ashoka was like 300 BCE, right?
Yeah. He is a Buddhist emperor. He is really the last person, I think, because it's shortly after Ashoka that Buddhism really loses its grip in India. Ashoka is really the last person that kind of has that really significant impact as far as Buddhism goes. So, yeah.
Was it a federalist state under to introduce federalism in India?
They did have states.
Okay.
Yeah. That I'm glad you remembered that. That might be too obscure to be on there, but certainly good to know. Yeah. And the idea of federalism actually came from the Persians. So, people often ask about religion. How is religion on the test? Is Hinduism on the test? What do I have to know? Do I have to know the Eightfold Path in Buddhism? Do I have to know the 5 pillars of Islam? Do I have to know the Hindu holy texts by name? I think it's important as a person to know those things. I've never really seen a source stimulus question that would connect that. There was a source stimulus question that had a Hindu passage that you had to interpret last year, but a lot of it was kind of making observations about Indian history and the context in which it was written, more so than which Hindu, principle is represented here. You know, karma, samsara, and that I just really wouldn't expect. I think you should have a working understanding of what Hinduism is when it was created, much in the same way that you should have that same working understanding of Buddhism and that same working understanding of Christianity and Islam, certainly. But that's a tricky one. But again, I think you need to know that they have epic writings, that they believe in reincarnation, and that there's this caste system in place that kind of governs these things. So that would be how I would address that. I just talked a little bit about religion, where Indian politics and religion intersect. Here you need the two A's, Ashoka and Akbar. Akbar is the other Indian ruler that you should know. If you don't know Ashoka, Akbar, or Gandhi, that's a huge deficit, those three. Akbar is the Mughal ruler who emphasized religious tolerance during an age in which Islam and Hinduism were frankly operating in opposition to one another. And Akbar represents kind of that principle that Gandhi emphasized, and we'll talk about Gandhi next week, but emphasized that principle that Gandhi did before Gandhi actually did it. The fact that all religions have merit, all religions have value, and that the Hindu subjects under a Muslim ruler should be treated with the same dignity and respect that a Muslim subject would. That was Akbar's really primary push during that age where there was, otherwise I would suggest there was some religious intolerance.
Is he the one that invited all the different,
Yeah. The Dini Ilahi.
So would you say Ashoka and Akbar pretty much had the same idea?
I would say Ashoka was more devoted to Buddhism and the promotion of simply Buddhism, although you could obviously make a very strong case that in making the jump from the Arthashastra, which was the Indian political strategy before Ashoka, which emphasized harsh consequences. It's a little bit like legalism. But making that migration to Dharma Shastra, ruled by kindness and morality, you could clearly make a case that kindness and morality find an audience in every faith. But he was expressing it in a very Buddhist way. I think Akbar was just maybe a little bit more open about those types of things. Other questions on that? Gandhi to come. We're not going to deal with Gandhi today. Trade and India, I think, is also a key thing. Emporias are a great example of that. You probably have forgotten what an emporia is. Does anyone have that awesome recall? I got to go to you because you didn't know who Akbar was, so we're going to go with you to get emporias.
Isn't it like the little seaside trading port things?
Yeah. And again, because of the nature of getting to India, going through the Himalayas, it's a little bit of touch and go there. You don't really want to do that. So most people that arrived in India were arriving via the seas, and because of the nature of emporiatic trade, when you would sail this way, you weren't sailing back for 6 months. So when you would go to India, the stays were much longer term than they were, for example, on the Silk Road, where you would stay at a caravanserai. Okay. Globalization in the modern world. There's the opening chapter to an amazing book called The History of Globalization. The World is Flat is the name of the book, written by Thomas Friedman. Talks about an Indian call center in Bombay or Mumbai. And we've all had this experience where we call someone, to ask a question about something, usually technological, and we end up, talking to Brad. But Brad sounds like maybe he's on a phone line from India. And that's kind of how we view India's so connected into the modern world technologically, culturally, socially, financially. And it's been that way since 1500. India has always been viewed as this remarkable trading chip, this prize, kind of right alongside China. And subsequently, Europeans have always been very interested in it. The Portuguese were the first to arrive shortly after Columbus had left for the New World. And subsequently, Europeans, with each passing generation, spent more and more time trying to establish trade relationships with the people of India. So India has been very heavily connected into that, and obviously taken over by the British in the 1770s through the year 1947. So general timeline: Indus Valley, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro. Difficult for me to see a lot on there. Number one, it's in that foundations period. There's a general rule that you're not going to see foundations written about. Maybe a short answer question, maybe it could be used and incorporated there. But we also can't read their writing, so a source stimulus kind of seems out of the question. I'll be honest with you, I use a lot of AP questions on your tests, but that first foundations test that I gave you, that is a really hard test to write because you have to come up with Indian questions, and there were 4 sources about India that frankly require an extraordinary amount of digging to find anything that you could use. So it seems unlikely to me that they would ask a source stimulus about India, because most of the sources that they would have to use are from outside that time frame. So India was the first urban culture. They are arguably the oldest civilization, but unfortunately some of that can't be confirmed because of the lack of our ability to read the script that they wrote in. Okay. Aryanism is where we really see the blending of cultures, those people from Indo-European migratory patterns that came into India with their own writing, and they blended with the people that were there. That's what Hinduism is. Now, we know Hinduism was here because we can see images of it, but we can't read it. So really the first time that we're able to read about early Hinduism is here. Honestly, I think that's important. That might be something that could, potentially filter its way into something. The caste system, clearly something that also could potentially be there as well. Can I help you?
I'm looking for substitute trading. They have it here in the building somewhere. I'm not sure of that. I know, no worries. Keep going.
Yeah, I'm not sure on that.
When did it change from being able to not read their writing? Because wouldn't it have the same, it's that same area?
No, because these people came in, this is when that Indo-European migration happened, and they came in and they brought a language that we can read called Sanskrit. And then gradually the older writing that we couldn't read was kind of phased out in favor of this Sanskrit, which again is something that we can read. This is the age of Alexander. Alexander was very interested in conquering India, as he was interested in conquering everything else. But ultimately that was his last conquest. The Indian battle elephants were not something Greeks were a big fan of, and they kind of stopped in northern India and modern day Pakistan. This is the age of Ashoka. Again, I think he's really the big one to know. Couple small notes from here. Gupta is the age of the Hindu Renaissance. A lot of those writings become really important, such as the Gita. Some of those classical epic stories are formalized and put down on paper. Kanishka, another one that I would mention, he is the ruler of a Buddhist state. Actually, technically, you probably wouldn't call it Indian today. It would be Pakistani or Afghan because of the geography, but Kanishka connected India to the Silk Roads. So from that respect, he would be significant there. Invasions, the Huns also, as Kieran asked about a few minutes ago, have their place here. Islam comes in the year 711, and Islam from 711 through today will have a pretty significant influence into the Indian world. The Sultanates, that is that northern part of India that was controlled by local kingdoms of Islamic rulers. Usually that's not a huge factor on the test. I can't recall a question that I've ever seen about the Sultanate period because it was more regionalized and things along those lines. But
When exactly does the Silk Road end?
I'm not sure that it really has.
Okay, so, okay.
I think it certainly loses its influence after the development of maritime trade. Maritime trade is easier and you can bring more stuff back, but the Silk Road is actually still active if you kind of think about it. It's clearly not as influential, but it's still active.
Did like the invasion of the Mongols, did that like have a big effect on like the production, the efficiency of the Silk Road, or did it just kind of dent it for a little bit?
Can you ask the first part of that again?
The Mongols, the invasion, like did it like have a big effect on the efficiency, or did it just?
Oh, it revolutionized it. That was the high point of Silk Road commerce because the Mongols would accept no robbery, no theft, no banditry, no thievery, no shenanigans. Can I say shenanigans on a Saturday? I think. Yeah. The Mongols put up with no shenanigans, thus the tempo of trade increased because you paid a very high tax to travel on that road. And when you paid such a high tax to travel on that road, a fee rather than a tax, I guess. But when you paid that high fee, I mean, your expectation is, hey, if I'm paying this huge fee, I want to be able to go without being bothered. And the Mongols ensured that. So, yeah. The Mughals we just did, imperialism we just did, and modern India we're going to do next week, so I'm not going to deal with those things unless you have burning questions about anything that's been pretty fresh. So Maggie, I think you had initially asked about South Asia. Is that good enough?
Yes.
Is
this presentation usually on Canvas?
I can definitely put it on Canvas, yeah. All right, one thing just to mention real quickly. Next week during IE, I'm going to have at least 3 days in which I'm going to have AP exams available for you to review in the room. I'm going to have the last 3 exam years in here printed with the answer keys so that you can just spend some time looking at it. Some of you just took the other day the 2018 test. I actually have 2 from 2017 that are different. There's usually an A test and a B test. These are practice. They should stay in the classroom. They will stay in the classroom. But if you want to come in during IE and just, because I mention frequently that I look through these tests and I know what types of things that they ask about. Tests have been released. Tests have been provided for educator use, but they do need to stay in the room. So IE is a good chance if you want to stop in for 20 minutes, do a couple sources, just look at a couple of things. I think is a really good way to study, because sometimes I think we get too fact driven. And I love flashcards. I used to be a flashcard guy, and I think flashcards still are good. But this test really does emphasize more skill than just kind of that rote. I think flashcards by nature kind of promote you to think about things in a rote way. And yes, you need to have context and you need to be able to place things within a time frame. However, you also don't need to be a walking encyclopedia. Okay? Because quite honestly, I taught this class 21 years ago when it required students to be a walking encyclopedia, which is why I kind of have that walking encyclopedia thing happening sometimes, but that's not really necessary. I mean, it's awesome, but it's not necessary.
How is the AP test like combined scores? Like how do you give it? So like there's the like the multiple choice, the DQ, LEQ. How is that?
The writing is 50%, the multiple choice is 50%. There's on the last page of the course description guide on the College Board thing, there's like this formula. Actually, if you go to a website, in fact, if you have your Chrome out, or if you don't have it out, open it up. I want to show you this. Because I think this is a good question that people ask a lot about. All right, so what I'd like you to do is to Google albert.io, which is a strange address, to be honest. Albert.io AP World Grade Calculation. And what happens, what comes up is, and this is probably the best one that I've seen, but what comes up is like a sliding scale where you can put, out of 55, what you kind of anticipate. And those people that took the practice exam the other day, if you finished 32 questions or 40 questions or whatever, I kind of converted it out of 55 so you'd have an idea. Like a 32 out of 41 or something might be a 42 out of 55 or whatever. But has everyone found this page with where you can kind of change the figures a little bit? And then when you hit calculate, it will use kind of the historical breakdown of scores to kind of give you an idea of what you are at. And you can really see that if you are a little more on the pessimistic side of the multiple choice, which I wouldn't blame you. I think that's the hardest part of the test, to be honest with you. Particularly because it's a time crunch and sometimes there's a lot of reading there. But if you go like 38, 40, you'll notice the writing can really elevate your overall score.
It says at the bottom, choose your score curve, 2019 projected, 2007, 2002.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
The test itself is standardized.
Okay.
So what's not standardized is the writing. I mean, the writing, there's very specific criteria. We've talked about this. If you have an acceptable thesis, you're going to get a point for it. If you use pieces of effective evidence, you're going to get 2 points for that. That isn't standardized. But what is standardized, if they have a 55 question, and I don't want to call it a curve, because curve isn't the right word. But if they have 55 multiple choice questions and the national mean for the score is 31, well, they have to take into account then the difficulty of the exam that they used. So you'd never really, there's no super firm cutoff. I can't tell you 45 out of 55, that's a 5. I can't tell you that. But what I can tell you is that usually by historical norms, and this is why my scale on source stimulus is the way it is, 85 is usually in that 5 range. And, as you move down the scale, we've tried as a group of AP World teachers to kind of make that as realistic as possible.
So our 4, like on our source stimulus exams that we've been taking,
It should be a reasonable comparison.
so 4 would be like an 85.
A 5 is 85 to 100.
Okay. So that'd be like what you
Right. So what I would tell you guys is this. If I could just speak real quickly. The test that you've been taking all year, you should not, 1 month from now, you should not be like shocked. You should not go into, and this happens, believe me. I hear the stories about it. Last year, I guess, was really bad. But people go into the test, and there's actually a video that is out there, and I guess it's a meme because it's a video that they've kind of added their own captions to it, and it's from a movie about the demise of Nazi Europe called The Downfall, but it's an AP World. It's actually, I can see why it's funny. I don't really like to show it because I don't like to make fun of that time period. That time period is pretty sensitive, but there's a scene in which Hitler is informed in this movie that the end has arrived. There's no military hope. The Allied forces are within 20 miles. And he absolutely goes ballistic in this movie, which you can envision based on how you've seen him address crowds that would be something that would happen. But in this AP World meme, it was made by some students who thought it would, that it would be funny to kind of talk about the AP test using how Hitler is so enraged. But one of the parts about it is they're consistently talking about the source stimulus and how they weren't prepared for it. You will go into the test and you will not find it to be any different from a normal day. Okay? Practice. If you play a sport, a practice should prepare you for the game. You shouldn't go into the game and think, oh my gosh, I didn't know there were 4 quarters. Okay? I didn't know there was a ball. I mean, what? I thought this was you will not find anything that's surprising to you. You will see source stimulus exactly the same way that you've seen them. Now where it becomes a challenge, instead of 20, you're doing 55. That's the challenge. Okay? So this is why I would strongly urge you to come in next week and just sit down with a packet and say, you know what? I'm going to do 10 or 15 in 15 minutes. You see how I do.
Is there a break anywhere in the end?
No.
Really?
This is why this is why this test is so hard. I think individually when you look at it, if you took the time frame of the 55-55 off, if you gave a break between the writing, I think it would be a lot easier. But they're not trying to make an easy test. That's not the point. That's not the point. This is it's purposely meant to be a great challenge.
Nick, do you know of any good Quizlets?
Yes, I do. And actually, in May, there's a national Kahoot competition, too, that's really good. You can do it. It's at 8 o'clock at night on May 14th. You can do anything you want at May 14th at 8 o'clock at night. I have no jurisdiction except one of you. I will tell that one person that's in here what they're going to do on May 14th at 8. But the rest of you, I have no jurisdiction over. All right. So, are there any other specific questions before I start activity 1? All right, everybody got a packet that says taking specific examples and molding them into AP content. This, I think, is one of the great challenges that we have. And I touched on this a little bit a few minutes ago. Ideally, you don't have to go into this test, and this is my AP review guide that I bought a long time ago. This is a different one than many of you have, but I like this one. This one to me is really good. It's nice if you have that level of reading ability and reading comprehension that you can just absolutely dominate this book and memorize all parts of it. Wonderful. That's great. Probably unlikely. Okay? So how do I take kind of specific content and think about it in an AP way? Because as I've told you, the isolated factoid is not really an important thing on this test. What is an important thing is being able to take that isolated factoid, put it in dirt, and have it grow into something bigger. Okay? Because, again, this isn't meant to be super specific. It's meant to see, are you skilled? Okay? So, for example, I get this question a lot, and we talked about this earlier with the Chinese dynasties. They're not going to ask you this question, which is the next dynasty in the order. Not going to happen. But what they ask about, they have a few things that they like to ask about. Does something change? If it changes, likely on there. Does it migrate? If it migrates, it's likely on there. If it migrates and changes, it's going to be on there. The spread of Buddhism will be on the test. You can guarantee it. Why? Because Buddhism migrated out of India and it went to India. And when it went, or from India to China. And when it went to China, it changed. Okay, it started to align itself a little bit more with Confucian values. Okay, if it migrates and it changes, you can be fairly certain that it's going to be on the test. So if you look at something and you're like, you know, I'm really interested who the sixth king of the Assyrians is. Please don't be. Please don't be. I mean, if you'd like to look that up, wonderful. Great. That's nice that you have that curiosity. That, I don't know. That's not going to be on the test. Okay? Because what's on the test, now, could Assyria be on there? It could. And Assyria has been a source stimulus frequently. But it's not going to be some isolated fact. If it's an isolated fact that you can't look at something and think, does this change? Does this migrate? Does this impact another society? If it does those things, then yes, it's likely going to be on there.
Can you name something like you learned about that wouldn't be on the test, that isolation?
I think those really super specific things, like a specific leader, that's just not really going to be a thing. You know, let me give you an example of something that might seem like a small, isolated fact, but if you think about it in a broader sense, it's going to be really important. In the 8th century, the Chinese started to use a new strain of rice that they adopted from a strain of rice in Vietnam called champa rice. Now, you might think to yourself, okay, dude, are we really going to have to talk about rice? No, you're not going to have to talk about rice. However, you are going to have to talk about the fact that the population of China during the Song dynasty was growing significantly. And when you have more people, you need more food. And champa rice has the ability to be grown 3 times a year as opposed to the traditional 2 times a year. So thus, it enabled the Chinese societies to produce more food, and subsequently, starting in the Song dynasty, the population began to grow and grow and grow. And today you have over 100 cities in China that have 1 million persons in it. There's a connection behind these things. There's a reason that China grew that quickly. And you could look at something that's a small, isolated fact and look at it that way. Bananas were introduced to the southern part of Africa in the 4th century. Okay, good to know. Great. But it was also part of a migratory group of people called the Bantu who took the banana and took iron technology and took a group of languages called Bantu and spread it throughout the southern part of Africa. So sometimes you see that thing that might be isolated and you're like, that's not really going to be relevant, is it? Do I really need to know that Tang Taizong founded the Tang dynasty? Does Tang Taizong migrate? Does Tang Taizong change? Then you can rule them out. And I think what you ultimately usually end up ruling out are people. But what you don't rule out are concepts, commodities, and ideas. Those things tend to be of greater interest. I think there's more flexibility to write about those types of things than there are super specific references to people. Okay, do you have to be able to list all 6 of the Hindu holy texts? No, I don't think so. Okay, but you should know that there are a number of Hindu holy texts that have led to the cultivation of that remarkable faith. That's important. So it's the way in which you look at things. So if you're studying and you come across something in your book, I'll just, okay, right here. Persian satrap. Most of you gave me this look. You look like you did the aftershave in Home Alone. Okay, that's the look that I just got. Do you have to know what that is? Does it change? It's Persian federalism. It's like how they had states. Does it change? No. Does it migrate? Not really. Used a little bit in India, we mentioned it. So I could probably rule that out. Okay, I could probably rule that out. If it didn't change, it didn't migrate, probably going to leave it aside. So let me give you an example. The key is to take knowledge, and this is the bolded part of the first page. The key is to take knowledge that may seem factual or trivial, like the key changes that came during the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and to apply it to a broader concept. Okay, they're not going to ask you which ruler was deposed during the Iranian Revolution of 1979. They're not going to ask you who deposed them. Okay, because again, that's not really the point. What they want you to know about the Iranian Revolution isn't that in 1953 the Iranians elected a communist named Mohammad Mossadegh, and then the Western powers overthrew him in 1955, and then there was That's not what they want you to know. What they want you to know is that in 1979, Iran experienced an extraordinary event of nationalism, and it was based around Islam. And they overthrew a leader who was very, I think, compatible with the United States, very flexible in his dealings with the United States. And as part of Iranian nationalism in the 1970s, they were moving in a direction where they were opposed to the United States. And that's how it still is today. 3 days ago, President Trump declared the military of Iran as a terrorist organization. That was a significant declaration. Okay, so this is part of a broader thing, not some small isolated fact. So you need to know about nationalism, Islamic fundamentalism, post-colonial experiences, what revolutions look like, policies of the Cold War. Those things are important. The name of Mohammad Mossadegh or the Ayatollah is not. Okay, so that's how you take those things that might seem to be small facts and you kind of blow them up and you make them bigger. So if you flip the page, I gave you another example. Here's example 2. They won't ask you who the leader of the anti-Westernization reform movement was during the Meiji Restoration and the Satcho Alliance. They're not going to ask you about the Satcho Alliance either. But what they want you to know about the Meiji Restoration is that this is Japan's ability to move away from what China did. This is Japan's ability to incorporate Western ideas successfully. This is their ability to industrialize, to modernize, to create an empire, and eventually lead to World War II. Those are how you would take an idea that might seem small, isolated, and expand upon it and make it something bigger. Okay, and ultimately when you're doing your testing review, if you're looking through a review book or if you're on the module and you're looking at these things, ideally, hopefully you can take some of those things that you might look at and say, oh, this is one of those isolated concepts, I don't think I'm going to need to know this or whatever. Think about it in a broader context. Okay, and I've given you a model for doing this. Okay, does it change? Can it be compared? Does it migrate? Is it in multiple periods? A Persian satrap, as interesting as that isn't in multiple periods. Okay? A Renaissance painting lovely. It's beautiful to look at. It is not in other periods. So if it only affects one period, it doesn't migrate, it doesn't change, it can't be compared to anything else, it's not part of a broader concept, you're not going to see it. It's too minute, it's too specific. Okay? And again, usually this is people.
Can we be sure they're going to talk about the different revolutions, like the agricultural, industrial, scientific?
It's pretty scientific, no. Scientific is often used by the student to establish the point that other cultures did not have that historical process. Because the scientific revolution does not migrate. And if it doesn't migrate, then it's more of a Euro-specific concept. Now, I think the scientific revolution is phenomenally interesting, but I think it's most useful in that it explains the fact that Europe experiences this phenomenal upward trajectory, whereas the rest of the world maybe does not. That's how I think it's maybe the most useful. Okay. So I've given you a few examples. And hand mutilation in the Congo is the next one. Does it change? Can it be compared? Does it migrate? Is it part of multiple time periods? Is it part of a broader idea? And with the Belgian Congo, that is not some isolated event. Okay? Because does it change? Yeah. I think the transition of the Congo, as we've talked about that story, that's an interesting part of a broader story. It's not an isolated thing. Persia today, now known as Iran, doesn't use federalism. That's not really a thing. Okay, so that isn't something that's really made that migration. The sixth Assyrian leader is not something that you need to focus on. Okay, the founder of the Tang dynasty, well, maybe nice if you're playing in a trivia thing, isn't really going to be something that is going to have a huge effect. I'd rather have you know that the Tang dynasty used a civil service bureaucracy and that they were a golden age. Those things are more important than Tang Taizong. Okay. The Congo is a representation of colonial abuse. It's a representation of what Africa faces after, and it's a representation of Congo's 20th century situation. So that, for me, checks a lot of boxes. So I think that would be something that you would see again. Okay. So I've given you a few examples. One I did for you, Japanese industrial growth, and I used the chart. Does it change? Can it be compared? Does it migrate? Is it part of multiple periods of history? And does it relate to a broader concept? So I've given you one example. We have 9 others. And we're going to go through those right now. We're going to take a little break of listening to me talk. I know as riveting as that sounds. So what we're going to do, you 4 have number 2. And you can go and spread out, and we're going to report back here in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. You 4 have 3. You 4 have 4. You 5 right there from Sydney over, you guys have 5. Wrapping around there to Anna, you guys have 7. Where are you going? Oh, you're not doing this part? Oh, okay. Bye. Let's have this kind of middle group here, Ardsley back to Emily. You guys are 7. You guys are 8 right here through Maggie. I'm going to put you in these 3. This is going to be a treat for you. You guys are 10. So go away for 10 minutes. Come back and we'll talk about what you found. Can you take a narrow concept and make it bigger? I have